Hey, this is John. Thanks for joining me for this Patreon exclusive video. Well, that sounded pretty ominous, didn't it? Anyway, thanks for joining me. This will be the last part of this series on building Bandai's Shoretrooper figure. As you can see, I disassembled him just a little bit. It'll make the painting steps a little easier from this point on. That's one of the great things about most Bandai kits, is that you can put them together, pull them apart, put them together, pull them apart, and they handle it just fine. And this one is no exception. Although trying to get the upper torso from his lower portions here, that was quite tough. It's a little ball socket that goes inside a poly cap. I had to mat it a little bit to get that doggone thing apart. Anyway, I'm going to cover, and I say at the beginning of this video, I'm not going to do a lot of heavy weathering on this thing. By the end of it, I may have weathered it heavily because I tend to get carried away, but we'll see. Anyway, I'm just going to go through the various steps that I'm doing and see how this guy turns out. Okay, the first thing I'm going to work on will be the weapons. And what I want to do to start off with is I want to use a sponge and just sponge on a slight variation of this very dark gray that I have here. When I was in the Army and I had, my M16, it was never a single color. There were, I don't want to use the word scrapes because the surface wasn't actually scratched, but there were color variations from handling, from, moving through the brush, from pulling it in and out of the weapons rack. I mean, all sorts of things. So it had a varied appearance all over it. Now, at this scale, trying to replicate that is almost impossible, but I do want to do some things to just suggest some variation on the surface. So for that, I've mixed up roughly 2 parts neutral gray, 1 part German gray. It may have been 3 parts neutral gray and 1 part German gray. Depends on your definition of what a drop is. And I've got that in my palette. And of course I have my piece of paper towel and my handy dandy sponge. And I'm just going to dip that in there. And you've seen me do this. I'm just going to sponge that on. I'm not going to worry about being neat or precise or getting too much or too little in any one area. I'm really just wanting to introduce some tonal variation. The reason I do it haphazard like this is if later on I want a certain section of it to not have this tonal variation, I can just go back and paint over that particular section. But it'll just give it, as a basis for later steps, just some variation to the surface. So let me finish up doing these guns and with this step, and I'll move on to the next one. Well, that went pretty quick, and you can see, if I can get it in focus, that it just gives it some tonal variations, suggestions of scrapes and scratches, and just, a used look, or the basis of it. This is not obviously the final step. I think it just gives a good basis to achieve that depth of finish that's so important, I think, in building our scale models to a advanced degree. So that's going to be where I start. The next thing I want to do is some dry brushing. And for that, I'm going to drop down a little bit to neutral gray so that it's a little lighter. And I'm going to use my big makeup brush for that. And that'll bring out some of the highlights. And I'm going to go fairly heavy with this neutral gray. And then I'm going to try and see if it makes much of a difference to go a little lighter with some sky gray. But let me get everything prepared for that, and I'll show you that step. Okay, for the dry brushing, I like using this big makeup brush. It's soft and fluffy. It holds plenty of paint. If you've watched my videos, you've probably seen me use it before. It's really useful because it's just so soft. It's meant to be used on eyes, I guess. Every time I need my wife to get a new one of these for me, I'm like, what is that stuff called that you put on your eyes? And she'd tell me, I don't even remember. Is it mascara? I don't know. But I'll say, yeah, get me one of those brushes. And she's like, why don't you just tell me to get the makeup brush? And I'm like, okay, yeah, get that makeup brush. Anyway, I'm just going to go in here and I'm going to dry brush this. And I'm going to be fairly heavy about it because I want this first layer to really, really bring out a lot of the detail and maybe change the color a little bit. You'll see later steps are going to make more changes to this. The sponging already brought out some of the detail, but this will just really start making it pop out. And if it's heavier than, my goal here is to be heavier than a normal dry brush. I actually in my mind call this a wet brush because it does more painting than a traditional dry brush would. But it just gives me more of that, it gets me more towards that depth of finish that I was talking about. And you're saying, well, but that covered up most of the last step. Kind of, sort of, maybe. When you really get in close, you can kind of see how it's all merging together. It's definitely one of those details, one of those ways of doing things that when somebody, I gotta glue that, when somebody gets in close and looks at it, that's when I really want them to be rewarded. If you're looking at it out here, you know, you go, okay, that looks like a used weapon. When you get in here, I want people to be able to see, oh, okay, there's a lot going on there. As I always do, this will be eventually, I'll try to sell this on eBay, and I'm hoping that, you know, the buyer will look at it and they'll examine it very closely and they'll like it and enjoy it and hopefully come back to buy more, to be honest. But anyway, I'll continue dry brushing. I think I finished that one. I'll get this one done and show you the next step. Okay, the next color I'm going to use is Vallejo Sky Gray. This is my absolute favorite dry brushing color. I use it on just about every build. One thing to note, if you're using a big fluffy like this, and you're going to be switching from one color to another in the same session, then I don't recommend washing the brush off because it will hold so much water. Trust me, I found out the hard way. You won't get all the water out of here. You're just going to have to set the doggone thing aside and let it dry. Now, if you have 2 or 3 brushes, that makes it easy. I just have this one. So what I do when I'm switching colors is I just simply, I guess you'd say, dry brush the heck out of it onto a piece of paper towel until I'm getting almost no color off of the thing. Now, it'll mix with the next color that I'm going to use a little bit. It may darken it a little bit, but not enough to be a problem. And if it is a problem, if your color change is so drastic that it creates a problem, and you only got the one, you're just going to have to either find another brush or wash it and let it dry. Suppose you could use the hair dryer. Anyway, I've got to get this in my palette and I'll show you that step. Okay, on this step, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not going to be going for as much coverage here. I'm really going to be looking to just bring out the most raised detail. When you're doing this, you make as little contact with the part as possible. And so I'm just going to be barely flicking it to hit those raised details. Now, it's still going to impart some color, especially on the flatter areas. I'm going to follow this up when it dries with an acrylic wash, probably the Citadel Nuln Oil, but I may go for the Vallejo product, thinking as I go. But what it'll do is it'll darken some of the flatter areas, but it'll leave these raised areas in the lighter color, and it'll give us a little more contrast once we add the wash. I don't know why I keep saying we. It's me. You're watching. You're thinking, what is this idiot doing? Anyway, let me finish this step up and move on to the washes. For the shading, I'm going to use Citadel's Nuln Oil Gloss. I like to use the Nuln Oil Gloss because it gives a little bit of a glossy shine to it. And if it's too much, I can go back later and hit it with a satin coat. All I'm doing on here is just slopping it on there. I'm not trying to be neat or particular about it, because since I've made such fairly strong highlights across the weapon, I can go in with this shade and the highlights are going to stand up. And some of those areas where I didn't want it to be quite as bright are going to get darkened down, those wider areas that I mentioned earlier. And in the end, it should, well, okay, let's be realistic. It's going to look like a little toy plastic gun anyway, but it's going to look like a slightly more realistic toy plastic gun at the end. So I'll just put this on here, see how it looks when it dries out, and then decide if I need a second coat. Probably won't. All right, I've applied the Nuln oil and it looks pretty much like I want it to. And you'll see at this distance, I guess you'd say, you know, more of a normal viewing distance, something like that. You see the, you know, you pick up the edges, there's areas of dark, there's some tonal variation that's kind of, you know, a bit murky at a normal viewing distance, but the payoff, and I don't know if this will come out on camera, but the payoff, and there's still a little bit drying here on the end, is that there's a lot of tonal variation. There's a lot of surface variation going on there that when you get up close, you can see, and that to me is the payoff. That's the reward for, okay, let me get in here and look at close and let me examine this thing. That it's more than just, you know, a little bit of edge highlighting in a single monotone color. It just gives it a little more life, I think. So I'm real happy with how these turned out. I'm going to let that Nuln oil dry a little more and see if I want to do anything else, but I'm pretty much happy with how they are and ready to move on to the next steps. For the armor parts, especially the cream colored parts, I want to do just a little bit of edge highlighting, and for that I'm going to employ dry brushing. Now I've done some tests off camera because I wasn't sure which color. I had some ideas on which color to use, grays or, you know, tans or whites, very light colors, but of all of them, I found just plain old cold white worked the best. So I'm going to do some dry brushing with this, and I'm going to very lightly go ahead and touch on the what's that, turquoise, the blue-green surfaces, and maybe even the red, because I think it'll work there. And it'll just bring out the highlights. I don't want it to look too drastic, but there'll be some chipping later, some darker colors to represent chipping. So in areas that don't get chipping, I do want something to kind of help the edges stand out a little bit. So I'm going to do a quick dry brush of that. I'm just lightly going over the detail just to give some difference, and I'm barely going to kiss the edges of the colored part, the greenish colored part. What the heck is that color? I'm not good with colors. I tell my wife that I only know the guy colors: red, yellow, blue, green, orange, and purple. Everything else is just, you know, some shade of that. She always says, well, what about beige? And I said, I don't know what beige is. Is that like tan? If it's not available, if it's a color not available in my limited wardrobe, I don't know what it is. Anyway, I'm just going to continue around the model, giving this light dry brush just to make some edges pop. And as I'm seeing it go on, it's also doing a little bit of weathering. That's okay. That's what I want, because that's where we're headed. Okay, that actually worked better than I intended. I just want to do some edge highlighting, and I got a little heavy-handed here on the chest, and at first I thought, oh man, that sucks. And I looked at it and I said, I kind of like that. So I went back over, because I was finishing up with this, I went back over many of the parts with the white, because it kind of gives a scraped effect. And I'm going to be doing more of that, but I liked how that turned out. I got a little carried away here on the head, and I'll go back and repaint that black stripe. But it just did a nice job of, on some of these colored parts, just introducing a little bit of scratching and additional wearing. It almost, even though it's white, it almost looks like it's color painted onto the cream color and that it's just wearing through, which is perfect. That's just, I mean, that's just perfect. And you can see there how that looks. I love that. Now what I want to do is I want to do some darker chipping to suggest that even this color, this cream color, is painted on, and that the actual color is some kind of ceramic armor or something like that. And so to do that, I want to use German gray. You know what? Scratch the German gray. I did some tests. I liked it. I started doing it. I didn't like it. I'm going with neutral gray. I like that better. Now for applying the paint, I'm not going to be doing dry brushing per se. I'm going to use this wide brush like this. But what I'll do, get my paint turned around on my palette here. I'll get a little of the paint on. Let me demonstrate on this piece. In some areas, trying to keep it on camera, in some areas, I'm going to use the edge of the brush like that, almost to do a sponge type chipping. If you're hearing in the background my cat, he's telling everybody it's time to get up. Anyway, I'll do some chipping like that. I may do a little bit of dry brushing on some edges and see where that takes me. And then in other places, I'll use the end of the brush. That's more than I want. Let's smear that. Yeah, I like that. I'll use the end of the brush to just do a few little chips like that. So I'm not using the brush to do one particular application type, but multiple applications. And I'll just go across and see if I can add those chips in so that at a viewing distance it looks, you know, like I want. So I'll do that. We'll see if I can avoid overdoing it. And I'll show you what that looks like. All right, I got the chipping in place. I'm pretty happy with it. Some places I really like how it turned out. Some places maybe not so much. But I'm not going to panic about it. Many places I don't like I'm not real sure how I feel about this right here. Because I can go back later and correct that. I want to get the washes on and some other effects to see how it all works together, because sometimes when you're working on something, you can apply some technique and you go, that doesn't really look real great. And so you go back and you cover it up and you try it again and you try it again, and maybe it's not looking like you want. But I've found that many times, if something's not, I mean, as long as it's not egregious, if it's not exactly what you want, keep going, add additional things on it to enhance it, subdue it, modify it, whatever. And I've been surprised the number of times that something that I wasn't happy with at, say, the 20% stage of doing something, when I got to 70 or 80%, all of a sudden I'm going, oh, okay, I like the way that looks. That's working. So I tend to leave things as they are and only go back later, and when I'm looking more towards the final product and seeing what looks good, what doesn't, what do I need to adjust, because a lot of times when everything is all together, it works. So keep that in mind when you're working on weathering your models. Next thing I want to do is I want to get some panel line washes in on this guy. All right, to do the panel lining, I'm going to use this 502 Abby's Lungs Starship Filt to really make them stand out. Now, Bandai plastic does not work well with odorless thinners. If it gets down in joints and stuff, it can create some problems. It will actually can weaken the plastic and it can break. So what I do when I'm working with Bandai plastic, and I want to do panel lining with oils, is I make a thick wash. This is not runny at all. I have to paint it into everything. But what it allows me to do is, once it's painted into the various panel lines, I can go back, damp a small brush with odorless thinner, and I mean it's just barely damp, and just kind of blend the edges in and work it around. It's not enough to run, and that's the key. There's nothing going to run into the joints, but it gives me a very distinct, very sharp panel line separation, and I don't get the tide marks that I would if I used an acrylic product, which can be a little more difficult to clean up. Now, there will be some areas where I'll get a little bit more thinner on it. If it's a large area of plastic where I know that I'm not going to have to worry about a gap, I may use a little more thinner just to help it flow a little better. But like in places like this, you can see I've already been kind of working on it. In places like this, where there's the parts join right there along the back, and there's a peg inside there. If thinner gets down in that peg, it's going to eat that peg up, and it may not hold it. Now you can glue it back together. It's not an unrecoverable problem, but I like doing it this way. It also allows me to feather the edge a little bit, so that if I want something to look like it's grimy and not just providing some shadow, I can do that too. So let me get set up here so I can get in a little closer while I try and film it and show you the application. All right, I'm going to work on this knee piece here, and I've got some of the oil on my brush, and I'm just going to go in here and I'm going to paint a really fine line. These oils make it really easy to paint a fine line, and this is not a special brush. I think I got it in bulk. I think these are like $1/4 a piece, but they're really good for this kind of thing. And I'll just go in and I'll paint all those lines in. It's going to take me a little while, but I'll paint all those lines in, and once I'm done, like I said, I'll just go back with a little bit of odorless thinner and feather that out. Whoops, got a little too much in there. That's okay. Oils are so easy to clean up afterwards. They have such a long working time that will work out. But I just keep going in and doing this, and then, like I said, I'll go back in and clean it up, and it'll look pretty good. I'm going to go through and do a little bit of this, and then I'll come back and show the cleanup step. Okay, you can see that I've got this leg piece covered in the oil. I've got a little bit of odorless thinner here in my palette. I'm going to dip a small brush in, and I'm going to work most of it off of there. And then all I'm going to do is come in here and just begin, make sure I'm on camera, just begin lightly nudging at the edge of the oils. And it's going to bleed a little bit, which is fine. That's the effect I want. But I'll just go through and just gently clean up and blend the oils, occasionally wiping off the brush. And I just kind of proceed along like this and work it off. It takes a little longer. I think it gives a really good look when it's done. And because you're being very careful about the application of it, you're not as likely to get in trouble with the Bandai plastic. So now I've seen guys take oils and take the thinners and they just go right into it. And sometimes they don't have any problems. And you know, if you want to do that, that's cool. I've done it. I've been bit by the Bandai plastic bug a couple of times though. So I try to be a little more careful about it nowadays, because I don't want to mess up all the other work that I've done. And especially I don't want to have something break on the inside that I don't realize, and it gets to the buyer's house and they try to move a leg or an arm or something like that, and it just snaps off. So yeah, that wouldn't be cool at all. So I just continue going around the model like that and just blending that in, and it gives it a really nice, grimy, weathered look. All right, it took me a couple of hours, but I got everything panel lined and blended and stained and all of those other things, and it's had overnight to dry, and I'm very happy with how it turned out. It gives a lot of sharp distinction there, I think, and I use the oils to just do a lot of streaking and staining to give some variation to the look of the armor, because I want to make it look like it's an actual used thing, and I'm happy with it. It's not. I probably could have, if I would have done some more airbrush work ahead of time, some pre-shading, some post-shading and fading and things like that. It might have given a little more tonal variation, but overall I'm pretty happy with it. So that's all the armor parts, and I think those are good to go. The last major step is going to be to give a little bit of highlighting and so forth to the pants. Now, I could do the brush paint job where you spend a lot of time developing the shadows and the highlights and things like that, but I'm a little bit lazy, and I'm going to pull out Big Fluffy, and I'm going to give a shot at dry brushing this thing in some successive lighter colors and see how that turns out. I'm going to start with this leather brown from Vallejo. It's just a little bit lighter than the base color for the pants. This was primed with Mr. Mahogany from Mr. Color, so it's got a fairly dark look. That color is going to represent the shadows. At least that's my plan. I may have to go back in and pump them up a little bit. What I'm counting on is I can start with a heavy dry brush that's going to add a lot of color across most of the pants, and then lighten that color up and just progressively get lighter and do more and more discreet, I guess you'd say, dry brushing. So I'm going to do it all in this direction down because I want to try and preserve some of those darker areas. So I'm just going to go in, and I'm being fairly heavy with the pressure. I'm not being too worried about not imparting, it's not that I want to impart just a little bit of color. I want it to be a little heavier and get some of those shadows to come out and some of the raised edges to just stand out more. And I don't know if it'll show up on camera, but I'm liking the results so far. And I'll admit, this is a bit of an experiment. I don't paint cloth texture very much. I've worked on some with some Warhammer figures, and worked on my technique with really painting the stuff in by hand and working at that. But to be honest, I'm liking this kit, but I'm ready to move on. Sometimes when I get to the end of a kit, there's other things that have come along, and I keep thinking, man, I'd rather be moving on to that. So it's a fun kit, and I'll talk about it in the wrap-up, but there's a lot of other fun kits out there too. So sometimes when I've had one that by necessity has had to drag out a little bit, I'm ready to move on. All right, what I'm going to do is introduce just a drop of this Iraqi sand into the leather brown to lighten it up just a bit. Now with this lighter color, I'm going to try and be a little more discreet, I guess you'd say, about my dry brushing and really focus on just the raised areas. I'm not going to be too worried if some spills over, because that'll just give me some variation. But I simply want to get those raised areas and start bringing up some highlights there. Now, I'm not going to necessarily hit every raised area because some of them are not as prominent, and those areas I don't want to receive as much of a highlight. The trick with this is to give some variation. That's what goes on. You're building in fake light and shadow. So fooling the eye. I have this theory that it doesn't have to be perfect to fool the eye. It just has to be plausible. So that's the theory I'm working on. We'll see. All right, I've mixed up an even lighter color of the leather brown and Iraqi sand. And this time I'm going to switch to a smaller brush. It's still a flat, soft brush, but it's going to allow me to get a little more precise in terms of where I'm laying down the color. Now here I'm going to be much more selective about where I hit because I want just the highest edges to get this color. The goal, of course, is to end up with a fairly subtle transition. I mean, I don't want any stark jumps in color. I want to keep it fairly subtle so that it looks, I mean, let's face it, it's a toy. It's going to look like a plastic toy that's been painted, but the light and shadow will help the brain suspend its disbelief that it's a toy, or it will create disbelief, you know, that the brain will accept, okay, this is not a toy, but it's an actual thing, and you kind of go into pretend mode, I think. And even if a viewer that's looking at it doesn't get to that point, they can at least look at it and appreciate the fact that they see the things that you would see in real life, light and shadow and folds and texture and things like that. It's just a matter of degrees of highlighting. Now, if you're trying this and you're in a real hurry, you could probably just put the base coat on, do one really good light highlight. It might still look pretty cool, but I'm hoping to get a little more subtlety in there than just one color. Okay, for the final dry brush step, I've got this color it's mostly Iraqi sand. I think it's like 3 parts Iraqi sand, 1 part leather brown, and I'm going to use this same brush, but this time I'm going to be just right in on the ridges, the major highlights, to really try and punch up the highlights in one final step for that, and then see how it looks and where I need to go from there. Okay, on this, I'm really just trying to get just the tops, and I just failed there, but okay, we'll live with it. But just the tops of the raised areas. And I'm being fairly careful about this. Doing this doesn't require that every single ridge be highlighted. I'm just going for the major ones. All right, I think I'm happy with that. Like I said earlier, I could have done this by brush and probably developed a lot of the highlights and shadows a lot more. But like I said, one, I'm ready to kind of get done with this. But two, I think this works. I've said it before, and I'll continue saying it. A lot of people look down on dry brushing, but I think it's a very good technique that gives a look of its own. Now, if you're doing this and you're not entirely happy with how much shadow was preserved, you can go in and put in a very subtle wash to bring out some of the heavier shadows, or you could paint it in. I mean, I could take the darker brown that I started with and mix it with some glaze medium and just really kind of go into the recesses and try and boost or deepen those shadows a little bit. but I'm happy with it as it is. So this guy's just about done and ready to do I guess you'd say, a final reveal. Okay, I've got everything assembled, and as I'm looking him over, I've actually spent a few minutes looking him over before I started the camera rolling, I guess you'd say. I'm pretty happy with how this guy's turned out. I'll give it a little time and come back and look at it to see if I want to do any minor adjustments. Usually at this stage, if I do any minor adjustments, it's maybe to add a little chip here or there, or a little bit of stain or shade, something like that. But as I'm turning him around, just looking at it right now, there's not much that's jumping out at me that I want to do. I liked the way the dry brushing worked. I think it kind of goes with the rest of it. It all kind of works together. Make sure if you're doing this, I didn't show it on camera, but I also did the dry brushing here on this ammo pouch thing and on his feet, so that it would look like the rest of it, look pretty good, hopefully. But yeah, this is let me turn him so I can get him on camera a little bit. This is a result I'm fairly happy with. Now, as a final wrap up of looking at the kit itself is fabulous. There's it's Bandai. Come on, it fits great. It looks really good. It captures fairly well the look of the figures, or the actors, I guess you'd say, in the Rogue One movie. The only thing that I could complain about, and this is bigger than just this kit, but I think I've always felt this way, and this kit convinces me of it, that in some ways Bandai's models suffer from articulation. And by that I mean, I get that people buy them to pose them, and you have to have articulation, so I understand that that's going to be there. But I think that some of the look of this, in terms of if you're wanting to paint a figure that looks really cool and you're more worried about the look of the figure than necessarily articulation, a fixed posed figure would have been better in my mind. I mean, you've got this separation of the shoulder joint here. I mean, I can push that in and take certain camera angles for my photos so that doesn't appear. But your pants here, that's just supposed to be one piece of cloth. I mean, this, by design, for it to be able to move, it has to have some joints and things like that. So like the feet here, that's by necessity for the articulation. So as someone who's not real interested in posing my figures when I'm done with them, I set it in one pose and leave it. I think, if anything, these kits could be improved with just simply creating a fixed pose, and it would give a much more unified look to the whole model. But I know that's not going to happen, so I'm not going to worry about it, because everybody understands that's what it is. That's what you're looking at. So nobody's going to worry too much about it. Now, if you're really high speed, you could go in and you could put him in a pose, and you could put in some sculpting putty, and you could remedy all these things that I'm talking about. And if you like doing stuff like that, God bless you. I'm not patient enough, nor skilled enough, nor smart enough to do stuff like that. So I'll take him as it is. But I'm going to call this a wrap on this video. I'm happy with how this guy turned out. I will do a public wrap-up 10-15 minute video just to talk about the kit. I'll take some photos, have them up on the blog. So look on the blog in the future for the photos of this guy. Thank you so much for sticking with me through this video. I hope you've enjoyed this series on building the Bandai Shoretrooper from Star Wars Rogue One. And thank you so very much for being a patron. It's your support that lets me do the things that I do. It lets me get, you know, the various upgrades for, like, I've recently got a new microphone. I have, you know, looking for a new camera, some better lighting, all of those things to try and bring a better and hopefully more useful and helpful product to you. So with all that being said, happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.